All right, again. Good evening. Welcome. My name is Peter Christian Eigner. I'm the director of the Gotham Center for New York City History at the Graduate Center, City University of New York, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's conversation. If this is your first time with us, I invite you to learn more about the Gotham Center online at gothamcenter.org, where you can find digital exhibits, dozens of podcasts, hundreds of recorded interviews and panel discussions, and nearly 1,000 articles, book reviews, and more on all things New York City history. Those of you looking for a deeper dive may also be interested in our new online education program, Gotham Ed. You can view those courses, past and future, at gothamed.com. Tonight, as part of our regular series of free book talks featuring the best and most interesting new work on New York City history, we'll be discussing Jonathan Rees's Fulton Fish Market, A History, published by Columbia University Press in November. The Fulton Market has been a New York City icon ever since the mid-1800s, when it became the nation's largest fish and seafood wholesaling center, provisioning much of the United States for roughly a century. The enormous size of the city, and more importantly, New York's wholesale and retail network, meant that fleets of fishermen in the area could bring a wide range of fish to countless grocers and restaurants. Fulton was also the flagship, and Fulton was the flagship market in this industry. It also attracted generations of immigrants who often lived in Lower Manhattan, and inevitably, as laborers at the Fulton Fish Market, introduced the rest of the 5 boroughs and the country to their own culinary traditions. By the 1920s, as the mafia took over New York through prohibition, labor racketeering, and the explosion of international trade, they also worked under the shadow of organized crime. In popular culture, the Fulton Market is perhaps still best remembered through the images Joseph Mitchell painted in his famous work for The New Yorker of late-night fishmongers, mobsters, and the city's old white working class, hustling in the last days of a bustling East River waterfront. In this new book, Jonathan Rees explores the market's inner workings and its historical significance from its establishment in 1822 to its relocation in the Bronx in 2005, telling the stories of fishermen, retailers, chefs, and others who depended on Fulton, and talking about how it shaped New York and U.S. and the United and American, and how it shaped the diet of New York and the United States. The book also uses this vital distribution point to argue that while the market's wholesalers were innovative businessmen who adapted to a dynamic industry, ultimately they were overwhelmed by the revolutions in transportation and preservation that occurred in the latter 20th century, which made Fulton far less significant than it had previously been. The book also explains how democratic and economic changes in the US affected the market over time, making this book in sum a work of economic, technological, urban, culinary, and environmental history. I'm delighted it has brought Jonathan to us tonight, and I will stop here so you can learn more from the expert. But allow me to first briefly introduce him and our discussant this evening. Jonathan Rees is a professor of history at Colorado State University, Pueblo, specialized in the history of late 19th century and early 20th century American technology, food, and labor. He is the author of several books, including Industrialization and the Transformation of American Life, a brief introduction, and Refrigeration Nation, a history of ice, appliances, and enterprise in America. This is his 5th book. Megan Elias is an associate professor and director of the gastronomy program at Boston University. Her research explores the history of food and culture through prisms of food writing, markets, and home economics. And she is the author of 5 books in this area too, including Food on the Page, Cookbooks in the American Culture, and Barbecue, a Global History. She is the author of numerous articles and book chapters as well, serves as editor-in-chief for Food, Culture, and Society, and is currently writing a biography of the hotel giant Conrad Hilton, exploring how hospitality became a major US industry. I'm going to turn things over to Jonathan now, but first the usual bit of housekeeping. As always, presentation and discussion will last until about 7:30 or so, at which point we'll take your questions. We have disabled the chat function out of respect to our speakers, but I encourage you to send in questions at any time during the next hour using the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. So with that said, as usual, please join me in welcoming our guests with a bit of silent applause.
All right. What I am supposed to do is the 5-minute version of this. First, I'm being heard and you can see this? Yes? Okay, awesome. I had this working. This is the sort of the 5-minute introduction to the book with just a few slides and a little bit of pictures. I should say at the very outset, the pictures on this subject are just fantastic. When I got the contract, I said, you can't limit me to 15 pictures. I needed at least 30. And then I ended up spending almost all of my advance on picture rights. But honestly, for the long haul, having all those pictures in there is more than worth it. So probably the first question you might be asking is, why is a guy from Colorado writing about the Fulton Fish Market? To be fair, I'm originally from New Jersey, but even then, once you get over to New Jersey, it's not really being a New York thing. For me, the answer to that goes to this guy, Joseph Mitchell. I'm a Mitchell person. I read Up in the Old Hotel just after it came out, and I was absolutely obsessed. To me, Mitchell is the closest thing you can possibly get in this world to time travel because of the thick description in basically all of his stories. And two, more importantly, it's reading Mitchell when I just sort of realized that New York City is just about the only place on earth. Well, maybe it's a little strong and I'm a little biased, but to me, it's just about the only place on earth where every single block of the city is historically significant. And I'm not just talking about Manhattan, obviously. He was in all the boroughs and sometimes out in the region. And he just made you feel like there's a story to be told and the story is important. And of course, as has already been mentioned, he wrote about the Fulton Fish Market, but when you really think about it, and I read Mitchell enough that I really did think about it, he doesn't really write about the Fulton Fish Market. He writes really close to the Fulton Fish Market without really making it his subject. If you know the book, probably the closest thing it comes is his 3 Old Mr. Flood stories, which are technically fiction, but that's another story. But Old Mr. Flood is a retired house wrecker, and who's just a fan of the market. He's not even somebody who worked at the market. Sloppy Louie is a restaurant near the market. The fishermen, sell at the market. He never really actually wrote about the market, but there's just enough sort of tantalizing glimpses in there that I thought a history of the market might be in order. When I was looking through the Mitchell papers at the New York Public Library for the first time, I actually found out that Mitchell wanted to do it. Wanted to do it himself. It was one of the subjects in his very long dry period at the end of his life that he was trying to address, and he never managed to do it. But I have 2 advantages. Not to say that I could ever write anywhere near as good as Mitchell did, but I have 2 advantages that Mitchell didn't. The first is online newspaper archives that are entirely searchable. It's been revolutionary for so many people in so many different fields. But for writing about the Fulton Fish Market, it's just wonderful because I found that basically every single one of New York's papers sent somebody down to the Fulton Fish Market at least once a year to tell you where your fish came from. And you can see those stories over and over and over again. And they look pretty much the same, but when you read 3 or 4 or 500 of them, you can actually begin to spot the subtle differences. So, for me, this is a COVID book. This is what I was writing during lockdown. It became actually a way that I could work during my sabbatical in fall of 2020 from this very room, just getting access to every online newspaper that I could, running Fulton Market and a few other subjects through the search engine, and just watching things come out that are just really fascinating and looking at the subtle differences to see change over time. That's Iceberg Tommy, one of the many crazy people at the market who get featured in these kinds of stories. But again, Iceberg Tommy did not work at the market. There's very little about the people working there, but the environment itself gets covered and the fish get covered in really great detail. Mitchell had no such access to this. He could interview people because he walked down there a lot, but he didn't have the same historical perspective that you can get today. The second advantage is I had a framework. Oh boy, where to even start with this? I know that the meat provisioning system predates Cronin, but Nature's Metropolis is where I knew it from. And you know what this is? This is the cattle down in Texas driven up to the cow towns, put on the railroad, slaughtered in Chicago, sent to the East Coast, a lot of it in New York, by railroad car. And that's sort of like the big provisioning chain in food history, because meat's so expensive, because meat's so important to people's diets. There had been a lot of focus on that. And I became interested. I wrote a little bit about meat in the book on the right, but it's probably the least original part of the entire book. I became interested in just provisioning in general. And so what I could do is write, when I'm writing about the Fulton Fish Market with a framework, I can write about the fish provisioning system. So even though the market itself, it's difficult to have a really gripping story just in that one single neighborhood, I can write about changes in the fishing boats, changes in the supply of fish, changes in the restaurant, changes in the system that preserves all of that along the provisioning line. And then use that as a way to frame the changes in the market in response to those other changes over the 185-year history of that market. This is the first book-length history of the Fulton Fish Market. I consider it to be just a skeleton. It's all you can do with a lot of newspapers and working from Colorado, but hopefully it's a useful skeleton of a history of a really interesting place. There's the fish provisioning chain using my terrific Microsoft Word skills. You go point of capture, the market's right there in the middle, like the south side of Chicago is for the meat provisioning system. And then the point of consumption is either homes or restaurants that are within an easy access of the market itself. What's interesting about this, and I couldn't, my illustration skills aren't good enough to really emphasize this, but over time, the arrow on the left from the Fulton Fish Market to the point of consumption sort of shrinks even as the volume goes out. I've seen oysters, for instance, that make all their way from Fulton Fish Market all the way to Denver at the height of the market. And so there's lots of fish going through New York and going out across the country. But over time, those arrows just become very short, and they don't go very far. By the 20s, but the vast majority of the fish at the market doesn't go but 100 miles away from the city, 100 miles away from the market itself. But the point of capture over time gets longer and longer and longer. So in the early 19th century, 80 miles away out to sea is just a huge distance to find your fish. By the 1970s, you can literally fly in fish from any point in the world. So I think that's a sort of an interesting thing, and that's related a lot to the technology, and it's related as well to demand. So by talking about Fulton Market, I can talk about the changes in the chain and the adaptations that the people working in Fulton Market, the businesses that operated there, had to make in order to adapt to those changes. So really, the book isn't so much about the market itself, although obviously it's the center of it. It is the Fulton Fish Market provisioning chain from many angles. Try to talk about the businesses, and there are lots of them, how those change over time. I try to talk about the technology. I am the refrigeration guy, and that was sort of my little in to convince Columbia University Press to give me the contract. And so not surprisingly, I think that refrigeration and ice are really important to the history of the market and to the history of fish consumption. I'll try to talk about the fish. There's a lot of different types of fish. I focus on maybe 5 or 6 different fish. Actually, I should say seafood, because oysters aren't fish, that are probably most important and get the most attention. I talk about the neighborhood, which changes just really drastically. What we now call the South Street Seaport is just a completely different place 150 years before the market closes, and even 50 years, it's yet another different place. And at least to some extent, I try to talk about the people, at least what the sources will let me do, the people who work there, and how their job changes over time. And try to start at the beginning in 1822 and really end in the present. That is the 5-minute version of this. And I guess we'll probably talk about a little bit of all of this. But that's sort of what the book is about. So I'm going to stop this.
Thank you. That was great. Introduction to a lot of the things that matter in this book. And I have lots of questions for you that I hope will sort of piece it together for folks who haven't read it yet as well. And I just wanted to say how much I appreciate a history of a market. You know, that's something that you don't see enough of. I hope this is inspiring to other people to focus on markets too. And I wanted to start us off with a sort of a simple maybe question about sort of from our field, from food history, that we often see the more popular works in the field are commodity histories. And what would you say is the difference between a commodity history and a market history?
Well, commodity history is obviously going to focus on a single food. I have developed a fondness for doing very close to the exact opposite. And it starts with our work on refrigeration. I mean, I sort of started in the history of labor, moved slightly over to the history of technology, which ended up being refrigeration. But the wonderful thing about refrigeration for me is that I could talk about, 10, 12, even 20 different foods in the same book. And they're all sort of interesting to me because both the similarities and differences. So I've been more interested in change over time and differences between foods at the same time.
Yeah.
Well, if you look on a single commodity, that you're just not going to see that sort of thing. Getting to be like an expert on, I don't know, rice or something like that, I think has its place. And I find those books very interesting. But for me, I want differences. And I know some of you are thinking like, well, he's just writing about fish, right? It's like, no. There are turtles in here, terrapin, green turtle, oysters, and of course the fish themselves are just remarkably different. I mean, not an ichthyologist, don't claim to be one, but reading the old stuff, the old science of the fish was just absolutely fascinating. And the differences between fish are just as great as the difference between different types of food.
Thank you. And I wanted to ask about your use of the concept of a market, which it's also for me is one of the most important things about this book, is that you write about a market as a place and a market as a concept, right? But the market, the physical market exists, and then the market for all of this seafood also exists. So could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yes. So I mean, the physical place would be where the commodity is exchanged for money. And that changes a lot over the course of the market. I think that probably the most important insight I have is that the Fulton Fish Market is not like a single building or 3 buildings. Really, it's the whole neighborhood. That the exchange is happening out in the street, the exchange is happening in other buildings in the neighborhood that just happen to be owned by fish companies. You would just go to the area and presumably you would know where to go in order to get the particular fish you're interested in. And that's where the exchange would take place. The Fulton Fish Market is, more sort of, it's more an idea than a physical place. And of course, the idea of the market is going to vary for each individual product, and it's going to change over time. Where's the demand? And of course, one of the great things about fish is the demand is going to change by the hour in some cases, right? Because if you have this big pile of fish and it just got there, you're going to get the highest price because it's fresher. 6 hours later, it's not going to be so great. The next day, you practically have to give it away. So the market as a market, the exchange is just so incredibly variable. I mean, there's a general market in individual fish. I'm just to think of one that's particularly important. Salmon, when they're easily accessible in the 19th century, always do very well. But then the individual fish has a different market depending on the season, whether a big catch just came in, whether people want to eat it at that particular moment. So it really changes. The fishmongers can cultivate a market for some fish, but then at other times, the consumers are driving the fishmongers to get more of something else. So it's all over the map. And I think those changes are part of the fun of the subject. I should say, I'm sort of arguing against, at least when Mitchell was alive, the general tendency that, oh, the Fulton Fish Market is out of date, it never changes, we might as well move it to the Bronx. It changes all the time, every single day. You just have to know what you're looking for in order to see those changes.
And I think one of the great details that keeps popping up in this book is how the physical space is kept deteriorating.
Yeah.
But if you're, because that's part of the thing, if you're putting wet things onto wooden structures over and over again, so they're constantly falling apart and having to be literally renovated. And then along with that goes different ideas about what belongs there, how they should be sold. And as you're saying, what should be sold too, right? What do people want to buy?
There are at least 7 different Fulton Fish Market buildings, and that actually depends on how you count them. And like I said, throughout the history of the market, a lot of the business isn't even in the buildings, it's out in the street.
Yeah, so what's the difference between who gets to be in the building and who's out in the street?
The people who are in the building are the people who are members of the Fulton Fish Market, the Fulton Fishmongers Association, the official companies, but even they do some of their business out in the street as well, certainly by the end.
So it creates a whole, as you were saying before, it's a whole neighborhood-wide enterprise.
Right.
Yeah.
At one point, because I like musicals, I was going to compare the whole thing to Brigadoon, and then I decided against it. It's like suddenly the city comes out in the middle of the night, and it's gone by 7 a.m. in the morning.
Right. It's a sort of a temporal geography as well as a spatial geography, right? That it exists in certain hours. So
absolutely, that's part of the adventure for the reporters who go to say where your fish got from. They have to like show up at midnight and have those discussions until everybody's gone in the morning. I think there's obviously a whole New York after dark literature. I might place those stories in with that.
Yes, I think they do belong there, right? I was thinking about Cindy Lobel's book, Urban Appetites, and how she showed how markets made the city and the city made the markets at the same time. But she doesn't get really to talk about this market. So I was wondering if you could talk about those two things. How does the city make the neighborhood? How does the neighborhood make, how does the market make the neighborhood and the neighborhood make the market too? Or do they?
So this is where probably the most important change in the history of the market, the most obvious one. I need to do just a little bit on that first thing, which is that the Fulton Fish Market is not the Fulton Fish Market when it starts. It's Fulton Market, and it's a retail market. So the people in that neighborhood would buy everything there. And so, Lobel's book is very 19th century, and it's very retail for most of that time. Really, really good stuff. You can see there, the game is there. Any kind of, just everything you need in order to live is available at the market. You would go into the retail market, you would come, and they're individual customers, and you would go out. The fishermen are there from the beginning. And they proved to be particularly popular. I think the reason they're popular there is that it was really easy to land boats. And you could also, if you wanted to, you could just sell the fish straight off the boat to anyone who wanted to buy them. And so over time, the fish business concentrates in Fulton Market, and they become a more important part of things. You ask how the city affects the market. The city rents the fishermen, first the buildings, then the space, once the fishermen have their association and are rich enough to build their own buildings. So it's always one of those municipal markets. And those policies encourage it to specialize in fish over time. How the market makes the neighborhood is, it changes a lot. First, it's a residential neighborhood in 1822. It becomes an industrial neighborhood as the as the market grows, it becomes almost an abandoned neighborhood in the early 20th century. But then the city wants to push it out to the Bronx, and that turns out to be a 50-year process, which they eventually win and they leave.
Mhm. Could you explain a little about that process?
Oh, that process. Well, they wanted them out of there because it's it's lower Manhattan. Lower Manhattan starts to perk up again in the 1960s, and so Wall Street is coming in that direction. More people want to live there. The land itself is really important. Of course, the South Street Seaport, the whole project is involved with this. But as Lindgren points out in his book about the neighborhood in the late 20th century, the South Street Seaport Museum sort of has it on their radar to care about the market, but it's not their be-all and end-all. They're sort of focusing on about 1840 when the market was barely selling fish. So they're eventually just both priced out and they are developed out in the sense that when the city really leans on them because they want apartment buildings and things, and nobody wants to live near the Fulton Fish Market. The smell alone would be terrible. The feral cats are around all the time, even when the fishermen aren't. It's a relatively long story. Some of it was sanitary. Some of it has to do with the mob again. They tried in the 70s, but they ran out of money. Rudy Giuliani tried again in the 80s, even before he was mayor. And in 2005, they finally left.
And there's another kind of resistance to that move that you talk about, I think really powerfully in this book, which is the romanticization of the
Yes.
market. And
Yes.
I think there's a lot of romanticization in food history in general, and it really can often get in the way, but you show how it gets in the way of, the proper functioning of the market as well.
It is. I think it's fair to say that the Fulton Fish Market is sort of like the last major industrial site in Manhattan where you can go and see blue collar people doing their work, even if it has to be at midnight. And so a lot of people still wanted that to be there, including the people themselves who didn't, the workers themselves who didn't want to commute to the Bronx in order to do their thing.
So there's a funny thing there where this is an industrial site, but it's also sort of a natural site, right? Too, because
Yes.
it's stuff right out of the ocean. How do those two things work together?
You want to see where your food comes from, and it is literally a tourist site in its last decades. People go down there just to see the spectacle. But the spectacle is not entirely sanitary. It's not particularly conducive to good fish. And it was going to go at one point or another. I think it's a miracle it lasted there as long as it did.
Yeah. What is it, do you think, about that that setup that did not produce good fish? It did in the beginning, right?
Lack of proper modern refrigeration. So when Baltimore or Boston are becoming really big fish distribution hubs in the early 20th century, they'll find an industrial space where they can install the most modern refrigeration possible, including cold storage, so that you can keep fish over days if necessary. And there simply wasn't enough space for that in Lower Manhattan. It was impossible to do.
But they hang on to it because they have this tradition, even though it's not producing.
Oh man, this is so funny because we were talking about the mafia before this started. And I mentioned how I don't like to talk about the mafia because it sucks all the attention out of the room. And I forgive you, I promise. I know, but I think I have to. Yes, that question, the answer is the mafia. It's impossible to prove, but you should understand that the vehicle for the mafia presence at Fulton Fish Market are the people who move the fish from place to place. It's the union. I forgot at the moment, I can't think of the exact name of the union itself, but it's the union that represents the workers who move everybody's fish from the boats to the retail sites, the stands, and from the stands to people's cars or trucks. And so if you had really good refrigeration in there, those people would be much less necessary. The way it stands is if you cross the union that handles the fish, they'll just won't touch your fish and your fish will sit there rotting. So, I mean, it's impossible, to, at least with the ready newspaper sources that I'm using, to prove a direct relationship. And I'm sure a lot of people would fight me on that. But just put it this way, if you modernized everything, those folks probably would have frowned on it.
Interesting.
And that's simply not an issue in Baltimore or Philadelphia or Boston.
Because they had more space to.
They just simply designed their facilities differently, and they'd managed to design it without letting organized crime affiliated union into the place at the same time.
So since you are the refrigeration expert, could you talk a little bit about how that develops? So how we go from buying a fish fresh off a boat to being able to buy a fish that came from across the world?
Yeah. So there are a lot of different ways to freeze a fish, or even to chill a fish. But even today, the best one is ice. It has to do with keeping the skin moist and the eyes, looking not freaky. So, if you go to a fish store, the fish that's out that you can see will always be kept on ice. That was true in the 19th century. It's true today. So that's consistent, but the access to ice, how you get it, what it costs, where you make it, changes over time. 1850, New York is getting all its ice from the northern reaches of the Hudson River. It's cut in the winter, kept in ice houses up there, sent on barges, and then chopped up into little pieces at the Fulton Fish Market and other places for that matter. But they'll chop it up into little pieces and use it for refrigeration purposes. And they're sort of at the mercy of the ice trust for many, many years. But gradually, ice machines become a thing, relatively small, inexpensive ones where you can just plug it in and make your ice right there. And that becomes a thing. But then the space becomes a problem because the market it's all full of people selling fish, right? Nobody can get real modern facilities that'll give lots and lots of ice and they won't charge you an arm and a leg for it. And even then, they're working really hard from 1920 on. They're working really hard to just be as fast as humanly possible. The turnaround inside the market is as fast as it possibly can be, because that's another form of preservation through time.
And that's part of the allure too, right?
Yep.
That the speed of movement and the kind of, throwing fish around and all of these things you don't usually see. Once the fishmongers are able to pack fish on ice, you talk about there being a kind of a culture of abundance and variety in the market that then leads, just to completely give away the ending, leads to this completely unsustainable market for fish. That we want things we shouldn't want. So
there is, I'm just trying to think of how to handle that one. Even in the early 19th century, the fishmongers will often have an interest in fishing boats. So they're partially vertically integrated, will go through a fish very quickly. And it doesn't mean the fish is necessarily extinct, but they will take out as much of the easily accessible Manhattan or salmon or shad as they possibly can, and then they'll just go on to the next fish. They'll get it from further away. And eventually they're going to get it from all over the world because there's a market for it. But then you combine that with demand all over the world for the tastiest fish like bluefin tuna, and that becomes completely unsustainable. But that ethos of simply not worrying about the supply because they can always move on to a different place, has very early roots in the industry, and you can see it at Fulton Market.
Yeah, I think that's one of these the great things that food history like this can do, is just show us that the problems that we have today had much earlier beginnings than we think, right? That overfishing didn't begin 10 years ago, right? When people started panicking about it.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think this is in the book because I ended up skipping it, lobster, but one of the freaky things I found out, I never realized this, there used to be New York lobsters. Like, there were New York lobsters, New York, Connecticut, all of that. And they ate them all.
Right.
Not anymore.
Yeah. And the obvious story also of the pollution of the river that
Yes.
restricts what can be caught, but people continue to eat like shad with kerosene in it. Is that right?
Yeah, that's Mitchell. Mitchell was doing that in the 50s. The people who were, even though the river was very polluted. This is beyond my expertise. I was just reading lots of secondary sources, but I think it's safe to say that somewhere around 1900, the river and the harbor went from, we can kind of tolerate it, to no, you really can't. You can't fish out of most of it. But there were people who knew what they were doing. They could catch in some cases there was still lobster in the 50s, but they could catch fish like shad, and then clean it in such a way that it wouldn't taste too awful to them. So some of that was going on. I mean, of course, the Hudson is getting better than it used to be, but I don't think it. Last time I checked, I still don't think you can eat shad out of the river, which is sort of sad. It was sort of a really big 19th century fish. Shad is I think one of my favorites, because there's one I definitely do quote, where like the first shad of the season would come in April, and there would be a little parade through the market as they bring it to the right stand. I just love the whole idea of that, and the culture of the place. But that was specifically for shad, because shad was never had it, but apparently was delicious.
Yeah, there would be announcements in newspapers, the shad are running, those kinds of things. It was a big deal.
Well, this is a good example of the environmental stuff I was just talking about. When you can't eat Hudson River shad, whether it's all gone for that part of the season, you can get your shad from rivers further south all the way to Florida. So they'll be a little more expensive because you have to bring them in. But when the Hudson River shad are gone, there's still people processing, selling shad in New York. It's just not Hudson River shad anymore. You just go further and further south, further away, and run through their shad.
And so that really changes the character of the market too, right? It changes who's involved in it. So if you go from your local fishermen who just pull their boats right up and sell in the market to people who have to be middlemen for a global trade, how does that change who's there?
It's a transition. I mean, the fishermen disappear entirely. I think famously the last boat to arrive at Fulton Fish Market was 1980, but really there aren't any significant number of boats landing there from 1920 on. So it becomes a bigger, less personal, more industrialized industry. Everything's coming by train, and you've got lots of people who are processing it, but you never see the people who caught it there anymore. The fact, and that's actually part of the reason it moves, right? It's located where it's located because it's close to the water. But from 1920 on, it could be, you could land it in anywhere. You could land it at the northern tip of Manhattan if you felt like it, or you can land it in Midtown. It won't make any difference because it's all coming in by train.
Right. And then later some even by air, right?
Right. Well, not air, but it's the same thing with the train. There's actually a fair bit of barge traffic from the Bronx down the East River for a while. But that's stuff that got landed by train, like from Boston, for instance. It's not stuff that got caught somewhere in the greater New York area.
So the keeping it close to the water was more of that romanticization of of the whole
Yes.
scene, right? Though
Right.
there's fish, we have to have water, but it wasn't necessary for a very long time.
It is no longer necessary.
And it caused a problem because being close to the water, that's also very expensive real estate, and people wanted that. So that sort of helps push it out into the Bronx, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Let me see. I have lots of questions still. This is a funny question for you. How do you balance out the lore of the market and your archival research? So that Mitchell perspective, the stories that people tell, because those are so important to sort of the remembrance of the market, but then you find a lot of it is just kind of nonsense.
It's a good question. There are visitors to the market, tourists, reporters, magazine people, from its very beginnings. And so and those wonderful newspaper databases are very searchable. So for me, it's sort of a preponderance of evidence thing.
Mhm.
Like where does most of the material seem to come from? Is it most of the reporters saying the same thing? Are they saying a different thing? Is there something that's relatively contemporary that backs the much later stuff up? I mean, I've got to admit, a lot of this is feeling. When you use newspapers, there are great advantages to it, in the sense that you suddenly have an enormous amount of stuff at this
Yeah.
point, but not all of it is necessarily reliable. But my hope was that if I read enough of it, right, then you can find the more reliable stuff that's closer to the original story, then you're going to get a better result. I remember I was looking at the origins of fish fillets, in which lead to fish sticks, and there were like 2 or 3 different stories. And in that case, I went with what the secondary sources said was the actual one. Just skip the stuff you found in newspapers entirely and went with the other historians. So I mean, it's just it changes over time, but with volume, I mean, you can do. I'm still amazed at how much I could read just sitting here in this room, but with volume, that sifting process I think becomes a little bit easier.
But you want to keep in some of the lore too, because that's part of your argument that this place has been romanticized into something that it never really was. So you have to say, well, why did he keep telling these stories about this place, right? Even to the mafia stuff that you don't want to talk about, that's part of the character of the place, right?
I did it to myself there. But I mean, if you're of the right generation, the only thing you think about when you say Fulton Fish Market is the mafia. And that to me is unfair. So it's a lot of volume and a lot of pieces. I mean, some of this, I sort of imagine what Mitchell would talk about if he was actually writing the book. So there's a lot of Mitchell in here. I think Mitchell would be irritated by this book by how often I quote him. But if he thought it was important, I thought it was important. And I should say, if you do know Up in the Old Hotel, you know that he sort of follows my framework to something of a degree. He follows the fishermen, whether it's the people catching shad in the Hudson or the dragger captain off in Connecticut. Old Mr. Flood goes and walks around the market itself. Then he's, the restaurant Sloppy Louie's is right there on Schermerhorn Row. The Black Clams is the restaurants uptown. He's looking at every little piece of that. He's just interested in fish. One of the reasons I wanted to cover terrapin is because there's a really good Mitchell story on terrapin, and it turns out to be a really important dish in the market itself and in a lot of different places in the country. I remember my first reading said, I'm not sure the turtles fit in this. I'm like, oh, I can make the turtles fit in
Yes.
this.
Oh, they
So
definitely
then I
fit.
did the work. That required some work, but yes, you can make it fit. It's same sort of supply chain, same sort of, I mean, they're caught in different places. They keep differently. Apparently turtle meat, when you kill a turtle, either one, turtle, green turtle or terrapin, it'll go bad instantly. Same thing is true of lobster. Little facts that are not in the book. The same thing is true of lobster. So you have to bring them in live. There's no other way to do it, which just strikes me as crazy. And then prepare the dish very, very quickly.
Right.
Which is different than a lot of other fish if you have access to ice and refrigeration. So again, lots of seafood, but no seafood is exactly alike.
Yes. And there's the added sort of the added tastiness to something that has to be done right then and right close to where it's going to be consumed, that makes
But where you can see it.
Yeah.
The green turtles, I mean, other people have written about green turtle, so you may have seen this in other books, but the green turtle is actually had to be killed by the chef itself. I grabbed a picture of that, with this giant green turtle inside the kitchen, and to make usually it's turtle steaks if you have the whole turtle rather than turtle soup. You have to have a banquet. Everybody's got to have the turtle. And the chef has to kill it, and the giant green turtles fought back, so it could be pretty rough.
Good for them, right? So this is a question that I often have when I'm looking at kind of big picture food histories, is about desire, and how does desire kind of shape demand? How is it that people's predilections kind of create a market? And so I was wondering if you wanted to talk about that, but also about how different, changing demographics in the city changed the kinds of fish that people wanted to buy and that therefore were available. Did you see any of that?
Yes. No, I mean, as you can imagine, in any business transaction, people want to eat something, and then people will create businesses in order to sell it. Oysters are a Fulton Market staple, but in the 19th century, you didn't buy oysters wholesale there. The wholesale market was on the other side of Manhattan, south of Washington Market for oysters. They took that over in the 20th century when you had to start importing things, but that's neither here nor there. But they sold oysters because people would go to Fulton Market specifically for the oysters. That's when it's a retail market. That's when there's foot traffic. The Brooklyn Ferry was right next to Fulton Market, so there's lots of foot traffic of regular people who just want to see Fulton Market. So that's just sort of typical. What I thought was interesting is that the people selling fish could create markets for fish themselves. Probably the most interesting thing is that the whole market for scallops in America comes from Fulton Market. Nobody did that before the Fulton Market guys said, let's see if we can get people to eat scallops, and it turns out they did. So they can also drive demand, and what's related to this is the ability to name things. One of the things that just drove me to drink, other than the pandemic, was that so many fish have like 100 different names. Maybe not 100, but there's like at least 10 different names for Manhattan. And I had to even if I'm not using all of them, I had to learn how to recognize all of them. And part of that is to essentially fool your customers, to create something. I mean, think about the 80s and black and red fish. They would call anything redfish in the 80s because that's what people wanted to eat in the 80s. So they can influence demand that way as well. So desire is a two-way street when it comes to fish.
And people don't know enough really to say that's not a red fish. Right?
Exactly.
And they're not going to poke it.
Exactly. Particularly after it's been processed, right?
Yeah.
So you go there and you see if you have to, if you know something about fish, you can see the fish in its head and say, that's name your fish right there. But after it's been processed, basically all fish fillets look alike. I mean, I guess if you're really good, that's an overgeneralization, but certainly to the average consumer, all fish fillets look alike. Right. So that's going to be really difficult.
And would you talk about when that starts? Oh, sorry.
Well, if you're not a trusted customer, they will rip you off. And that starts really in the 20s, I think. There's some New Yorker articles about fish fraud in the 30s, I remember. People who went down in the 80s or 90s, if anyone listening did, I think that's a lot less common. They were doing a nice side business in small cash sales, probably not reporting the taxes. So I don't think they were as prone to cheat you at that point in time, because the business itself is just much more difficult.
Right. I want to ask one more process question, which is if there are other markets you think you might be interested in.
Other markets that I think that I might be interested in, like if I wanted to do another market history.
Yeah, because you know what to look for now.
That's an interesting question. I had not thought about doing another market history. I will tell
Okay.
you what I'm spending my time on, which is just something completely different, because I did something Eastern because I wanted an excuse to hang out in New York. I decided to do something that's, Western and Southern primarily. So I'm actually working on the history of the chili pepper in America at this point.
Great.
So I want to hang out in New Mexico.
Yes.
I want to hang out in New Orleans. This is how I pick my projects.
Very smart.
So, I mean, so it's a market in the abstract. I think that's
Yeah.
a really interesting question. Like, how do you develop a taste for something that has so much negative stereotyping involved with it? And I think that's true with some fish as well. But it's not a physical marketplace again.
Right.
If that,
But still the idea of a market, an abstract market being created for a
yes,
thing.
yes,
Right.
absolutely.
Oh, that would be
Yes,
so
yeah.
much fun.
I mean, I think what I'm really interested in, if you looked at my whole set of books up on my shelf over there, I'm interested in food moving.
Uh-huh.
And sometimes it's physically moving it from place to place, but sometimes it's moving through a culture, and sometimes it's sometimes it's like, like if you take a chili pepper, you can grow it in different places if it's similar climate. So the sort of like the whole species moves, and then a market is developed over there. So the movement is good. I think if you remember, if I'm sort of doing the provisioning system rather than the market itself,
Yeah.
I think I'm still interested in provisioning, but not necessarily markets that have hubs like the fish market did, or the fish market was.
Right. And I assume you'll find the peppers in markets and the pepper sauces in markets as you go along too. Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
what's it? Such an interesting subject because they can be such small batch. They sort of don't need industrialization. They get it and then they sort of don't really need it. Oh, how fun. Okay,
Yeah.
I have one last silly question for you, which is what is your favorite fish?
What is my favorite fish? Tuna. And not bluefin. I'm from a child, I've been canned tuna, mayo, celery, red onion, big sandwich kind of person. So I'm a tuna fish person.
Very respectable. And has this book changed how you think about fish consumption?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I knew it was bad. It's worse than you imagine in
Yeah.
terms of the limits, and the commons, and how to handle that. I don't want to be responsible for some of the fish that are not, it's simply not sustainable anymore.
Right. Right. Okay. I think that's all the questions that I have if we want to let other people have the fun.
Yes, and we have a couple, but I want to invite everyone who's viewing to submit your questions now using the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. And I want to say thank you, Jonathan and Megan, for a lovely conversation. I could have listened to that for a while longer yet. We have a couple of comments that came in from Dean, who says he purchased the book and has been really enjoying it. And then we have a question from Steve Marmon, who was an investment banker in the 80s, who lived on Pearl Street, right around the corner from Fulton, between 1981 and 86. And he said, I often wandered through the market and its streets after work at Merrill Lynch, and it seemed to me that it was clear the people who worked and bought fish there were part of a very tight-knit community. Did you get a chance to interview any of these people?
I did not. Like I said, this is a COVID project, so it's hard to, it is hard, and I'm really glad you asked that. It is hard to break into that community just to ask them questions, even if there's no pandemic going on. And what I eventually decided that a done book was better than a perfect book, which would include those kinds of interviews that might take an enormous amount of time. But when I thought about it, really that would be for like just the last 2 chapters. However, and I think this is worth advertising, particularly if there are New York historians in New York right now at the other end of this audience, is there's just an enormous amount that could be done more with the Fulton Fish Market exactly along those lines. I would like, you know, I live in Colorado. It's very hard for me to like walk over and say, will you please talk to me about your working life? But there are still people working in the Bronx who worked at the Fulton Fish Market.
Yeah.
And because these are so often intergenerational businesses that they're operating, they have the lore, they have the material that's going to go back 100 years or more with respect to what life was like in lower Manhattan. So, I mean, the idea of an oral history project coming out from somewhere in New York on this should be just ridiculously obvious. I also think that a digital history project that dealt with this is also something that people who are into such things might want to consider. I mean, at a very basic level, digital history is supposed to be bringing things together that do not exist anywhere else together except online. So you can imagine the signs, the cards, the tools that are in basements all over the New York area. I have hopes that the South Street Seaport Museum will at least do some of this. I don't think I'm telling stories out of school if I say that they're expanding at the moment. And they told me that they want to do more with the Fulton Fish Market, part of their mission, in their new spaces. But you know, a lot of this stuff is family heirlooms, and I think they're proud of it. They probably won't, you know, donate it to a museum necessarily, but they would love, I suspect, to know that people recognized that the fish business was important, and they would like to be able to see all of this stuff sort of reunited digitally again. So please, 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 if you're looking for some work in the greater New York area, please consider talking to these folks. I did not, but that's part of the reason I said this was a skeleton at the beginning. If you can go deeper into those relationships, I would personally love to read it.
Megan, it sounds like we have another project to add to our list.
Call me. I'll do what I can do from across the country. But
recipes too.
But you need actual New Yorkers to make those connections. There's no question, and I am not it.
And then there's another follow-up question to that is, were you able to explore the market at all? You mentioned at the outset of what sort of drew you to the project. I don't know if I caught, if you mentioned, maybe I'm forgetting it already. It's been a long week, or last was a long week. Did you get to explore the market that when you were in striking distance of the city?
I have not been to the new Fulton Fish Market again. Last time I was there was last year for the book launch, which was just 2 days. When I was doing my research, it was sort of hard just to get in and out, let alone actually talk to folk. I mean, for instance, I was the first person that the South Street Seaport Museum let back into their archives after COVID, because I just begged them so hard. And it really helped a lot. Getting into the market itself was just too difficult. I have been all over that neighborhood, however, and it's weird. I would leave the archives and I would just walk the neighborhood for like an hour and a half, because you would see things that I wrote about, and I would find new things about the neighborhood that I thought were just unbelievably interesting. So weirdly enough, that's now the place in New York I know better than anywhere else. Just to give you one example, I remember I was walking up to the subway at one point to go to an archive that wasn't there. And right at eye level was the plaque on the building in the space where Thomas Edison's generating station was. I'm like, oh, that was there. And I'm like, that makes perfect sense to me. It used to be in 1880, it was an industrial neighborhood. So Edison got that spot. I mean, it's now like a drugstore or something, but I was glad to see the plaque. And it's sort of thing, if you're really writing about a neighborhood, as I do, there are really 2 large chapters on the neighborhood itself. I had to know the place. And you can see the vestiges of the fish market there too. And then like in November, I got to go to the Tin Building, which was a ton of fun, which just reopened as a upscale food court. Ate very well, but it was just nice to be there and feel a little connection to what used to be there. I mean, I'm glad they did it. There's a nice little section in the corner with lots of Barbara Mensch's photographs that sort of honor the people who used to work there, among other things.
Catherine Hansen.
Bring your credit cards if you're going to the building, but I do recommend it. I liked it a lot.
Catherine Hansen asks, was it mostly men at Fulton?
Yes, overwhelmingly. There are a few exceptions. Some of the buyers are women. Telephone operators are women. And of course, in the later years, you do get women working there, the very later years, but it's an overwhelmingly male-dominated environment. And I try to write about that in the same chapter where I cover the mob, because I think the 2 things are related.
And a lot of this you said was passing on through family. So this would be sort of social capital in terms of the employment.
Yeah. One of the really difficult things, to be perfectly honest, I wish I could do more with the people, because I wish there was more in the record about the people who work there. But the reporters who went there all went there just to talk about the fish. The story was always, this is where your fish comes from. It's not like, here are the people who give you your fish. It's, this is where your fish comes from. So one of the funny things about those stories is it's hard to tell management from labor, because they're all dressed the same in great big dirty smocks. So yeah, I did my best with what I had.
Stephen has sent a follow-up on the seaport idea and says he's going to be working his connections. So you may just be hearing from.
That would be great. I mean, I know the Seaport Museum people now very well, and they're very nice. And they've been very helpful. They have the best collection of this kind of material in the city. There's no question. But even then, it's not that much in the great scheme of things. There is stuff to be collected, and somebody's going to make a really great collection out of it someday, I'm sure. I hope it's there, and I'm sure they're interested. But there's a reason. It's not just the pandemic that I had to concentrate on newspapers. We'll put it that way. The Mitchell papers were very good, but even then, a lot of Mitchell stuff looks like a vertical file in a library. There's a few interview notes and all the stories, but it's a lot of just other people's stories. God, there's maybe a couple of things in the New York Historical Society. Municipal reports were very good for the moving. I did that a year ago in November, got some really great stuff, but it is overwhelmingly newspapers.
Sanford writes, what are your thoughts on the difference between the old Manhattan Fulton and the new one in the Bronx?
Well, one is a place that operated and made a lot of people rich, but was slowly decaying over time. And the new one is a gigantic modern fish facility like any other place in the country. So one is easy to romanticize and the other is almost impossible to romanticize.
Well,
And honestly, it's better off for the fish. I was just, I remember going through just a few interviews, back stuff on YouTube and the like after the new one opened. And all these guys are saying something to the effect of, it's good for the fish. I don't particularly like it here, though.
Emily Brooks at the New York Public Library says, this is fantastic. As Dr. Elias knows, at the near NYPL, we are working on a curriculum about oyster houses in New York, and it was wonderful to have this resource on the Fulton Fish Market. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about the Fishmongers Association and the labor culture of at the market.
Oh boy. So two quick things. Two oyster chapters in the Fulton Fish Market book, because oysters are so important in New York City. One of them is 19th century, the other is 20th century. So that's oysters. Now I forgot the question. Labor culture. Yeah. So I mean, I know I said this before, but Fulton Fish Market is famous for serving them in the 19th century. So there are oyster houses all over the city, but you would go specifically to Fulton Market because there are these very small places. Two of them, both named Dorlands, actually, were the most famous, inside the market, where they're supposed to be the best oysters ever, because they're just all right there. But it turns out the people who are selling oysters are from the other side of Manhattan. They're just people buying them and cooking them there. But they cooked them there. The smell was all over the place, and a lot of the fruit vendors complained that it was ruining their product. So there's this sort of emphasis on seafood, both eating it and selling it from the very beginning. But oysters Fulton Market oysters are famous for the eating, not for the provisioning. When you get to the 20th century, the wholesale fish dealers start taking over the oyster business, because the oyster business is no longer local. The water is simply too polluted anywhere near Manhattan. The closest oysters are pretty far out on Long Island, where the water is much clearer, that they're going to be shipped in there. So they're importing oysters from wherever they can get them, branding them in some of the old brands, and selling them to the New Yorkers who still ate oysters. Of course, the Grand Central Oyster House is probably the most famous place to eat oysters, but that's like a 70s thing. It's much later than the 19th century, and all those oysters come from far, far, far away. On work culture, I think it goes back to being very difficult to separate the owners from the workers. Lots of people are working in the place. A lot of them are related to the people they're working for. The businesses, I was thinking of trying this at one point, but it just proved to be impossible. In my longer presentation, I have a slide, which is just one paragraph about the roots of one stand in the market. And it's like 20 different names of various businesses. And you can see like last names migrate through every single different business. So, telling one company from the other is just almost impossible, at least from the newspaper perspective. But that's the sort of thing that you can begin to sort out with just people's business cards that are left around, people's family memories, which people are related to who, will know more about different places in the market. I think at its height, there are maybe 130 stalls there. Some companies will have more than one stall, but it's just a lot of small businesses organized together in the Fulton Fishmongers Association. Just a sort of a communal organization that deals with the infrastructure of the place. And there's another, I don't think it's called the Fulton Fishmongers Association anymore, but there's another one in the modern market that deals with the communal issues of the place in the Bronx. It's just a way to operate a fish market with a lot of small businesses.
Catherine Hansen writes with another question. How did foodborne illness and epidemic affect the fish market?
Well, the best example of that is the oysters. It's funny. I found her on LinkedIn, Elizabeth Pillsbury, who did her Columbia PhD on sport fishing, also starts citing stuff on typhoid and oysters. And I'm like, you know, you and I might be the only people in the world who are obsessed with typhoid and oysters. So I got her to send me those papers, and I found some other stuff. It's definitely a huge problem, which is why the New York oyster industry, the very local New York oyster industry, essentially dies after 1900, when the water is just simply too polluted for oysters, which are of course filter feeders. Pollution affects a lot of other fish on the local level. Shad, I think, is probably the most noteworthy example that, you know, end up by the 50s tasting like kerosene. But you know, the Fulton Fish Market solution is to just bring their fish in from further away, and they could keep, as long as they can keep selling fish, and when you can start flying fish around the world, they're just not overly concerned about pollution. It's funny, around the 70s, there's just, it used to be in the 1870s, oh, local fish is great, buy local fish. In the 1970s, you know, New York fish stores were like, we sell only fish from far away. I mean, that's not what the sign said, but that's essentially the message, because nobody wants local fish because they know what the water looks like.
Right. So they can recast it as something exotic and luxurious.
Just different, right?
Yeah. Jonathan, I loved reading this book. I want everyone else that's with us to go out and buy it. And I want to say congratulations on publishing it. I wish you all the best success with it. I will look forward to the history of the chili pepper. And I want to say, Megan, it's always lovely to see you, but thank you so much for joining us tonight. Your questions were fantastic, as I expected.
Very much. Cool.
So we will be posting this video to our YouTube channel and sharing it with those who registered and were not able to make it tonight. We will also be meeting again. I hope that those of you watching will join us for our next event on how the Patriots burned down New York City in 1776. But that will be March 30th. So until then, I want to wish you all a good evening and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.